I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark.
I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Hi, everyone,
Hello.
and welcome to Arcane
And welcome
Mark.
to Arcane Mark.
And Squirrelash welcomes you too.
Yes.
Today we're here to talk to you about design diary benchmarking and playtesting. Now, why is it not just playtesting or not just benchmarking?
Mm-hmm.
That's because when you're in the tabletop RPG business, there is a sort of a spectrum of benchmarking and playtesting that is used to make sure products come out to a level of quality and expectations that you would want.
I get the sense that a lot of folks who don't have experience directly working in the industry assume that, like, oh, everything gets playtested. But the amount of time and effort that would take compared to the amount of content that, you know, companies like Paizo put out is just, like, you can't possibly playtest all of it. But benchmarking can get you a lot of great data as well.
That's right. Kitchave is saying that these plushies turned out well.
They
Linda,
turned out
show
to-
the
yeah.
little toe beads.
Look,
They
there's
have
toe
little
beans.
toe beads.
Toe beans.
Toe beans.
Little ones, and then little individual fingers and stuff, too.
Yep.
It's super cute.
There's lots of details on these. But, so Linda's absolutely right. Now, there are some companies in the tabletop RPG space that actually do play test everything they put out, but they're not the ones you think, because you'd be like, oh, it's definitely Wizards of the Coast and Paizo. It's not Wizards of the Coast and Paizo. Because Wizards of the Coast and Paizo put out products that are very, very long. And the amount of actual time it would take to do, like, a legitimate playtest of, like, 300 monsters in a book with 300 monsters is forever. And if you were just like, well, I'll run one fight with each of them, no, that's, as we'll get to later in this episode, that's sometimes worse than nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, not always. In certain ways, it's better than nothing because there's certain things you'll never find out if you don't play them. The companies that actually playtest everything are generally third-party companies that put out small products.
Yes.
If they only have a small release, they'll be like, yeah, this is a book with 8 monsters. And ones that have a decently sized fan base and put out small products. Like, we only 8 monsters. We had our large fan base playtest all 8 of the monsters in the 8 monsters. Or things like that. Even then, most of those third-party companies don't literally playtest everything in every permutation. But there are some who do. And generally, third parties have a higher percentage of content that they playtest than the big companies, just because the big companies have fast turnaround times on very large projects. And Falco Rhiannon says bonus actions weren't playtested in 5e. Well, I mean, that's true, but I guess bonus actions existed in 4e, so they, like, they knew sort of how they worked for things before, which is a little bit about how benchmarking works, and we'll come into that later on.
Do we want to talk about playtesting first or benchmarking? In some ways, I think playtesting is simpler to discuss because it has fewer variations.
I agree, and I didn't even tell Linda ahead of the episode, but I was also going to start off by being like, well, you think maybe that Paizo playtests everything, but they can't.
Yeah.
And they don't.
Well, that's something that I know that I've heard is like, you know, well, if you playtest all the scenarios, it's like, well, no, you know, we don't playtest all these things. Sometimes we often
You're lucky if an adventure gets playtested once by the author.
Although there's a lot of value for adventures and even a single test, because that will because that helps the authors see, like, particularly if they give it to someone else to GM and are around and watch the things that weren't quite as clear in their head as they are when it's being implemented.
Yes.
So
I mean, hypothetically, if, like, somebody developed a spell that summons infinite gemstones and gave it to Paizo, and then they could just do whatever they wanted, I would think that adventures having one playtest as part of the process would be a good idea, as opposed to, like, a monster having only one playtest, because that could really throw you off, because, adventure structure is something you can find out in one go, if that's
one thing that I'm getting onto a little bit there is that having someone other than the author of the content be the one who is testing it is good, because then the things that were just in the author's head but didn't make it onto the page, the assumptions aren't necessarily there.
Perhaps the ultimate playtest that the author could do is if they handed it to someone else to run while they watched and were not a player. And with virtual tabletops, it's easier to do that without it looking really awkward, like someone is breathing down your neck.
I'm like, ooh, hello.
Hello, I'm the author. If you make any mistakes, I will know. But like that actually could be very valuable to the author as they're going along. It could be valuable to a developer as they're working on the text. It's just it takes a long time. Not to say that no adventures ever had playtests. For instance, Doomsday Dawn did have playtest for the playtest was playtested. Although even then the some of the parts of Doomsday Dawn didn't get a fully playtested. For example, the death mode thing where your team just died. Our team just died before we got to the end, so some of the encounters didn't get playtested.
But then when we were doing it on stream with Bullman, he had to skip some of them.
Yes,
so
which also meant that not all of them were run. But you did beat the final enemy.
Yeah, we did do some different ones
while
that hadn't
skipping
gotten
things.
Done,
yeah. But I mean, I guess we didn't technically die. We ran out of time, but we clearly were when we were doing Logan running the playtest for us. But we clearly were going to lose because Jason's wizard, who was our like ace in the hole, got dominated and then used all of his best stuff to annihilate us. We survived that. My character was fine. Most characters were not, and without Jason's resources, we were like halfway through. We were on like the Lich. We had not faced the Demi Lich. We had not faced the big demons. We were not gonna make it. Playtests are tricky. And the thing about them that makes them tricky is, A, even doing one playtest can be tricky for an adventure. B, playtesting a monster one time really doesn't reveal what you need it to reveal, because you want to playtest a monster against multiple party setups. And when it's a solo above the party,
and when
it's a mook below, when it's around the same level as the party,
and
when
also
it's in
like
a mixed encounter.
And terrain things too. You know, if you've got a monster that's like, oh, you know, I fly around and I shoot pew pew arrows at the PCs. That's going to be way different in an open
I was going to say a manticore in a small room.
Versus a small room, yeah, exactly.
A manticore in a small room that is 10 feet high is easier to beat by a ton than if you fight it in the playtest Doomsday Dawn, where the manticore, despite having a nerfed ranged attack, it's a fairly low level and has a ranged flyer.
Yeah,
so
and also,
it was
like,
killing
if you
people.
only have one test, then things get really swingy. Like, you know, maybe the PC's got a lot of crits or the monsters got a lot of crit that time, and then you got a result that was like, you know, that was way outside of the norm, or you're not necessarily going to see the kinds of interactions that might happen played out across many tables.
Yes, you'll often see online a call for please do an actual playtest of this, and because we have enough like theory crafting. That's not because, in my opinion at least, that's not because theory crafting isn't valuable or the playtesting is inherently going to be more reliable, but more so because everybody is theory crafting and you have like hundreds of those and not very many people are playtesting, and you want to have both. Because both of them have strengths and weaknesses that we'll go through during this episode. Yeah.
It's also true that theory crafting can fall more in the realm of things that can be done with benchmarking, that the people who are working on it would be able to do, whereas playtesting across like a large number of different tables and experiences is something that the people working on it can't do. And so they're what the designers rely on the community for.
That's a key reason, because the designers can already benchmark, but we can't really playtest it. Not like you can. Because even if we do playtest it, we're playtesting it with what? The designers and like top developers who understand everything? That's not going to help to figure out what like someone totally new is getting.
Yeah, and it's also going to come with those players' own inherent biases and tendencies. Like, what tactics do they try to use? Like, are they
it already may have been built around those biases.
Yes, exactly. So if the people who wrote it assumed that people are going to use a certain set of tactics to approach it, and they didn't even consider, well, if you didn't think of that, then this monster is really hard, or what have you, or, you know, if you did think of this other thing, then the monster's circumstances change. Then you're not going to get that stuff.
Here's my favorite playtest story to show you the vulnerabilities, even of an open playtest with large numbers of people who played it. So, Quebec, at this point almost a decade, Occult Adventures playtest came out. That was my first playtest at Paizo. So I was running at it. I was at Paizo. I was looking through the playtest. Something interesting happened. There were tons of people playtesting, lots of valuable data, good benchmarking and theory crafting, good playtest data. But there was a certain theme to the data that really tended to be skewed, and in a bizarre way that we eventually managed to tease out. And it was that certain classes in particular, that encouraged people to play ancestries like tieflings or other ones that had dark vision were seeming to be more powerful in groups, especially when they were played as tieflings or half-orcs or anything with dark vision. There was just like, it's like, well, medium, which, in the playtest, some people were like saying that there were certain ways that it could become stronger, but some people were just like, no, the medium crushed everybody. My tiefling medium. And the reason for this was that the Occult Adventures playtest, in fact, when we ran it, the tiefling medium crushed everything. The Occult Adventures playtest happened to come out just after Emerald Spire was released. And the first level, the Emerald Spire dungeon, which is level 1, and everyone's like, oh, let's start at level 1, we'll run Emerald Spire, is a weird floor that Paizo CEO Lisa Stevens created that's full of goblins, and it has magical darkness everywhere that even light magic can only give you like a 5-foot area that is lit up, and it stays dark everywhere else. So that if you do not have dark vision, like, it just doesn't matter. The light spell in particular is very unhelpful. The dancing light spells is actually more helpful. Specifically, so like when we ran it, I had dark vision, so my medium was the best character. Not because I was a medium, but because I had dark vision. The second best character was the Mesmerist, who was a kitsune and had dancing lights as an ability, and could therefore do dancing lights to at least help people be able to see something other than just right around their own space. And so the problem was just like literally double-digit percentages of everyone played that adventure. And the most recent Pathfinder Society adventures that came out, there was one that was high level, and the low level one was a dungeon on an island where it was full of undead creatures. It was part of the Gloomspires. And then there were humanoids on the top who you would think are not immune to mental, because back in PF1, undead were immune to mental, but they were anyway because they were being controlled by a fiend that wasn't there, like called the Blood Queen. And so, if you made a PFS character to try things out, the only 2 things that were PFS legal that were new were playing Emerald Spire, which was sanctioned, or that dungeon. And that dungeon, everything was immune to mental. So everyone was just like, wow, Mesmerist is the worst class ever. I tried to use my stare and my mental abilities, and they always failed against everything. And it's like, you can wind... And there was nothing in the playtest that said you must play these adventures. It's just that's what naturally happened.
And that's what was available. And so that significantly distorted the data.
Yes. And so this is something that can happen even if you have a lot of data. So I'm going to circle back now and tell you the biggest weakness of playtest data, and this also goes into like survey data that you collect from a playtest, is sampling bias. Sampling bias is completely unavoidable for a game company that has any amount of money other than like WotC bucks. And even WotC, I don't think that, as far as I know, they've never done their playtesting in the way that you would use lots of the WotC bucks to avoid sampling bias, which is... It's completely wild. It's problematic because nowadays people from my generation and younger are not answering their phones or picking up or answering emails or doing things that people need to do for this. But to get a non-sampling bias data set, you have to like randomly ping Americans and be like, do you play tabletop RPGs? And then get them to say yes. And then will you do a survey and then get them to say yes?
Yeah. Because otherwise what you get, and you can't avoid this, but otherwise what you get is a thing where the data is highly biased toward people who look at a playtest and say, yes, I would like to take the time to do a playtest and to answer a playtest survey. So you're going to get a certain level of engagement and system familiarity that's not necessarily going to tell you so much about how this new thing reads to players who haven't played the system before.
Yes, that's correct. So basically, you wind up with some issues when you're collecting playtest data in terms of sampling bias and, of course, signal noise ratio. Signal noise ratio is a huge problem. Even companies like Paizo or Wizards don't have that many people who are available who can read everything. And so in small, like the small playtests from third-party companies, even fewer people are around, but at least they don't have quite as much data overall, so they don't have to worry about it. So signal noise ratio can be an issue. You have to think about how you're going to conduct your playtest and get your data in terms of the signal noise. Now, there are certain ways you can get it better. For example, the worst way to get things in terms of signal noise ratio is public commentating on some kind of social media platform or forum that people are already on.
Yes, it's completely undirected. It doesn't have any sort of
even if you come on to
grounding,
try to direct it, it gets swallowed up.
Yeah, it's going to have to do a lot more with things like social media algorithms than actual like reaching out to people more broadly within the community.
Yes. So better than that is a survey. The problem with the survey is that you have to be very, very careful how you're designing it. Just slight changes to questions that seem almost identical to like you if you looked at them, if you didn't study up on survey science, can drastically change the answer that you get.
Yeah.
Even on mathematical questions.
Yeah, so you can have if you have a question that is phrased, you can have questions that are phrased in ways that encourage people to answer them more positively or negatively.
Even if you didn't mean it. And if you ever put a neutral position, people are going to gravitate towards it even more than they should. So there's a lot of things you have to do with those. Secondly, you can never have a conversation with a survey. Even if you have it and you ask really good questions quantitatively, and then the qualitative free response answers are very interesting, it's very hard to then follow up with someone about something they said. Or iterating, you have to do surveys over and over and over and over again. So it's good though because it has somewhat more of a barrier to entry, so it factors out some of the noise. Also, when you look at your signal noise ratio in a playtest, you'll find typically on those public places that there's just a few people who multiply the noise by 5, and you're like, wow, these 3 people literally quintupled the amount of noise because they just repeatedly said the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
And so in the survey, generally, they will only say a survey once unless they, know that they're cheating the survey, which they not that many people in my experience do. And there's tools in the survey to catch people who do, and most people don't.
Yeah.
So there is then the best way to do these in terms of signal noise ratio, but that is weaker than both of the other two in terms of casting your net wide. Yeah. Which is a third way.
So I did want to talk about one more thing about surveys too. When you're doing them, you also have to carefully consider how long they are. Because the longer the survey, the more information you can gather, but also the more that people might get tired and say the survey's not worth my time and leave. And then you focus your sample even down more on the people who are most dedicated.
Yes. You would be surprised how many people drop off a survey once you add too much to it, especially free response. That'll get people tired quickly. So that's another weakness of surveys. Compared to what I will say is probably the strongest of the approaches, which is, you can also have a completely closed playtest that's just in-house, but it has the weaknesses Linda described before. It's got the best signal noise ratio, but I think the strongest approach is an open but restricted playtest where it's theoretically open to everyone who cleared a certain bar, such as everyone who pre-ordered or kickstarted this project can theoretically join this. They have some investment in it already, but then you ask them to sign up for it rather than just put it into a public place and then put it into a slightly more private place. This theoretically also allows you to kick someone out who's being problematic more easily because you control the private place, although in my experience you usually don't have to. You just kind of get people who are more invested, higher signal noise. You can have conversations with them much more easily, and you get very strong playtests from that. For example, the Battle Zoo Ancestry's Dragons playtest so far, I think, is one of the best playtests I've ever seen. I wasn't even working full-time for Roll for Combat at that point, just as a freelancer, so I didn't really have... when that playtest started, I was full-time during some of the parts of the playtest, but also had a ton of other tasks. And that this playtest, just even though I wasn't able to participate a huge amount, everyone within it just kind of organized themselves out. They talked, they discussed, they had arguments, but they tried to come up with not one conclusion that was one person's side, but summaries that were here are the 4 perspectives we came up with at the end of this argument/discussion. And here's, like, there were a lot of people on all 4 of these sides. And this is what we came up with. And this is why each of them said that. And they had summaries at the end. It was fantastic. And it was passionate, but also
it was respectful.
It was respectful for the most part. Sometimes things always
Generally.
get heated.
Yeah, I mean, any internet, you're never
get
gonna
heated on the internet at some points at all times. I don't want to say that they never did.
They didn't all hold hands and sing Kumbaya,
but at the end, the summary was just one of the easiest things ever for me to go through, because it was compiled by a few dedicated playtesters, and then everyone else made sure they looked through and were like, yes, I think this described my point correctly, or no, can you add this to that? And they added it, even if it wasn't what their opinion was, should have been there at the end. And that was so useful. It was fast, easy, efficient, and useful for updating the ancestry. I was able to add tons of ideas and adjustments based on the playtesters, in some degrees to more extent that I would have been able to otherwise, even though it didn't have nearly as many playtesters, which is the weakness it has over the other 2. Because by putting that bar, you are preventing your noise playtesters from coming in, but you're also preventing it from casting as wide of a net.
So there's no perfect solution. It's a matter of finding what's going to work best for you and your resources if you're doing a playtest.
Yeah, absolutely. And people in chat are talking about, like, market research firms and longer surveys give bad data. You're absolutely right, especially if, like you said, that people are paid. Were actually interesting studies that showed that sometimes paying people for their survey answers can actually be much worse in terms of compared to not paying them for the same answers, in terms of them actually doing it and giving you good data if you are in certain subsets of people. One of the caveats of survey research is that almost all of the research, like the standard opinions of how to do things, goes out the window if you have what survey scientists that I've read like to call, like, the PTA parent, which is like it's their example of someone who is super motivated and invested in a certain topic, and they want you to know, like the PTA parent.
Does this sound familiar to the gaming community?
Now, gamers are the PTA parent of their games. So therefore, most survey science doesn't really work well for them. But there is something that's known, which is if you have something that's more of the PTA parent, or like a gamer or someone who's already invested, once you offer them money, they actually may be less likely to continue taking their survey, because their brain thinks of, oh, this must be an imposition on me. After all, they're paying me to do it.
So if you look you had conversations about this, like, should we offer, like, lots of extra boons and benefits in the Pathfinder Society for people who take these surveys? And then it's like, well, if you do that, then you're going to run into this sort of circumstance with it. So it's like, okay, well, that instead of offering incentives to take the surveys, we'll put the incentives on the, like, play and report the scenario side, because then it doesn't mess with the survey data, but still encourages people to play.
So that is perfect. You can give, like, extra ACP or whatever you want to do. But yes, the weirdest thing is that made people less likely to do the surveys. As Kitchave mentioned, the kind of obvious thing that would happen when you pay people for surveys is that you get bad answers, especially if it's a long survey. Yeah. You can surveys are automated now. They have AI that can figure out when someone's doing this, but you'll be like, there sure are a lot of people who, after they got past page 2, just picked the first response on
every single
everything,
thing
and
past
then
that because they wanted the money.
Didn't fill out the optional free response, or filled it out with, like, NA or something like that if it required you to type something in there. So, absolutely. There's many pitfalls to surveys, but I like collecting them anyway because of the fact that it's great for quantitative data. And you're not going to get 1,000 people in your closed restricted playtest, whereas we've gotten, sometimes even in our Roll for Combat surveys, have gotten over 1,000 people answering them, which is, like, more than even, like, I've seen happening in lots of other places, or for playtest surveys even with bigger companies. I know Wizards of the Coast has mentioned that they had, like, in some cases, 500,000 surveys. The thing that's really wild to me is one person at Wizards of the Coast said that they read all 500,000 of the surveys, which, wow, that's a lot of time. They probably spent years of their life doing nothing else. And I'm not sure how they were able to, like, put that data into use in time to put it into the thing. But that is very
I
dedicated.
imagine in that case that there probably was a very small minority that actually had like free response comments, and it was mostly.
I think it was for a survey that had free response comments. Like I don't even know. I know how long it takes to read those, and like my first thought was that maybe that what they meant was that they used like searches and other things to specifically target particular entries and read them. But they clarified on Twitter that they read all of them, and that blows my mind. I don't even understand. Like they like drank energy drinks and were up all night constantly and did nothing else. Their eyes were like peeled open reading survey responses. But like it's really impressive.
Yeah,
so that's certainly way more survey responses than you're gonna see it anywhere other than Wizards of the Coast. That's for sure.
But I would say too, like when you're looking at the data, it's good to look at a few different things about when you have numerical data, a few different things about it, not just like the average or the mean, because there's two very different stories told by like, let's say that you had like a 1 to 5 scale or whatever, and your average was 3. Like, does that mean that most people say meh? Or does that mean that some people love it and some people are like, I really don't like this?
Yes, exactly. So, having it that just everyone's somewhat excited is very different than half the people are extremely excited and half the people are not at all excited because it's just not their cup of tea.
Yeah, because if half the people are super excited and half the people are not at all excited, then you can look at the people who are not at all excited and be like, okay, is there something we can do to get their interest, or are they just fundamentally not interested in the concept? And you also know then that the people at the top end, like, they're going to love it and they're going to buy it.
Also, just flat out, you could ignore the people who are not at all excited.
Yeah.
Listen, if you have 1,000 people and you have a choice between something that's 500
excited and 500
that has like 900 that picked somewhat excited, and the other 100 were spread around, versus 500 extremely excited, the top thing, and 500 not at all excited, I hate this. Yeah. You definitely want that 500 really extremely excited 500, I hate this. That is an amazing thing. Put it out. Ignore the people who hate it. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, fair enough.
They don't need to use that. Whereas the thing that everyone said meh about is actually terrible. You definitely don't want to put that out.
Because if people say meh about it, like, they're not going to buy the product, really. They're not going to play it. There's always going to be something that they like more. And so, like, you're just really don't have any interest at all in that sense.
Absolutely. You want to have something that at least some people are passionate about. If you listen to an interview with, like, I think Logan talking about Resonance, it wasn't even the fact that everyone hated Resonance, which is kind of the way the takeaway people have was, well, everyone hated Resonance. Even the new version of Resonance that was put out later on, where it was like a way to buff the item. But actually, no. It was more that what we found was that some people did hate it, but like mostly people were meh. And there was nothing that people actually could get excited or interested in of any of the options. Yeah. And so that's more of a kiss of death than having something that was polarizing.
Yeah, and I think too you can think about it too. I mean, it's not that having people react to it negatively is good. It's like, I mean, you think about the menu options, like,
you'd obviously still rather have something that literally 100% of people
or that half were meh and then half liked. But like, if you think about it, like, let's say that you have like a menu at a restaurant, right? And the chef is trying to decide what are good dishes to offer. The dish that everyone's mad about, no one's going to order that, so that's not worth your time.
Yes.
No, just like no one's going to select that for their character, so it's not worth their time. Whereas if you have something that half of the people are like, this is my favorite, and half the people say, well, I hate, well, the people who say that's my favorite, they're going to order it. And the people who say I don't like that, I hate that, well, they're going to pick something else on the menu.
I want to give you an example of that has been important for me to know. So, Battle to Ancestries, Year of Monsters. The order of the monsters we're putting out is not just the order of exactly their average popularity using a metric of like mean or median popularity. Instead, we had to look at the groups of people who are really excited about certain things. That's how we figured it out. You can even see this in the recent survey I put out for like potential future ancestries that were we did a ranking and then a rating. Where the ranking, you ranked among the ancestors, and the rating, you rated on a absolute scale. Okay? And there are just groups of people. And I can even classify some of them. Like, sometimes when you're doing multi-dimensional scaling or trying to cluster things, you can't come up with the name of what one cluster is, but there are obvious ones.
Like Shapeshifter in this case, right?
In this case, one of the groups is planar fans and planar haters, because due to the planar fans in the first survey, in the free response being like, put in more planar ancestries as options, the second survey had more as options. And there were some people who, if you go through their surveys, they picked like most of the planar ancestries as being very excited about it. And there were some people who put them all really low and are like, what? Come on, you're playing a daemon? That's like a monster. All of these things are from the planes. I don't see this as a good ancestry option. And look, there were a bunch of other ancestries that were on there that that may have gotten the same like average score as Devils and Angels, but Devils and Angels had so many people who were really into them, and also people were like just never that would make them more popular than something with the exact same median and mean score. That was all clustered around, we.
But
kind
that
of
would mean
like
that you don't want to release all of those right at the same time, because they're gonna interest the same people. Whereas you stagger them out. Like, weren't you staggering out things like mimics and doppelgangers and things like that?
Because they're very similar and the same people like them.
So
that's exactly why we wanted to get different groups of people. And Rico said that there's also the completionists who are like, well, you did demons, so now you have to do them all.
Yes.
Absolutely. And that could be a misclassification to put you in with planar fans, even though you may have answered like them. So, but what Linda just said is absolutely correct. And it's the same way that the chef who's making the menu, if, like, let's say that you have, like, I don't know, an absolutely fantastic caprese salad that you make and a fantastic steak. And half the people are really, really like the steak and half really like the caprese, and they're completely opposite of each other.
You don't want to make a menu that's like, well, I'm going to make a caprese salad, and I'm going to make, like, a margarita pizza, and I'm going to make, like, all these things that have the same stuff one month, and then, like, later I'll offer steak.
Yeah, you want to offer both of them close together so that then everyone has something they really like. Like, that's kind of how you want to do it. And you'd much rather not put out the thing that, like, if literally everyone either really, really likes one or really, really likes the other, you don't put out the, like, I don't know, potato salad that everyone was like, whatever.
Yeah, because nobody's going to order the potato salad. They're going to pick the one they like.
Exactly. So that's just a way that you have to figure things out with playtesting and with surveys. So let's move on from that to the second half of our episode with benchmarking. So again, as I said kind of near the beginning, we always ask the game designers, that is, for people to do more playtests, because we can't do 1 million playtests, but we can do 1 million benchmarking. That's easier. We always get more benchmarking, and so sometimes people get the sense that, benchmarking is not valued, or that, like, game designers weirdly want to see anecdotal playtest data. And look, playtest data is anecdotal, as I mentioned before. That it is a problem. You can get a very skewed perspective from playtest data, especially if the person who's playing one particular class is rolling high. There are some ways around it where you, like, get popsicle sticks that have all the numbers from 1 to 20, and then you have to draw them all out so that you are kind of forced to have an even distribution. Every character has their own set, and so does the GM, so that it's not like, the gunslinger always pulled the 120 from this shared set of popsicle sticks. But even that, though, actually doesn't tell the whole story, because it forces a more normal distribution.
Which isn't, it's never going to be that normal when you're actually rolling. You're going to have more skews, so.
Exactly. So, there's some things you only learn by actually playing it, because you're, now, sufficiently advanced modeling perhaps could be indistinguishable from a playtest. That is sort of true. Like, there are some people, like, I can, as a designer, from a skill I built up, not even from Paizo, but from trying to get high levels to work in 3rd edition and PF1 of D&D and Pathfinder, I got them to work. And the way I did it was by, like, running solo playtests with my PCs, knowing their tactics against the monsters I was planning to run. So there is a sense where a sufficiently advanced benchmarking can move into playtesting, where you're just kind of playtesting by yourself.
That's also playtesting, because there's a very important phrase in there that you said. It's because you knew our tactics. You were testing for a specific group, whereas, like, you can't, no one person's going to be able to model for, like, everyone out there. And so it's important to to have the different people in order to bring in a different sets of biases.
Correct.
All kinds of different ones, rather than the biases of the person making the content.
When it comes to benchmarking, you see different benchmarking that's used by different groups of people making different products. I'll talk a little bit about benchmarking in design. I'm interested to hear about like some of the benchmarks and tools that are used in developing adventures too. So in design, the most famous benchmarks are calculating expected values or other probabilities by using mathematical models to, for example, multiply the chance to hit by the expected damage on a hit, the chance to crit by the expected damage on a crit, and see how much damage that is on average in a round or in an action by action situation. Now, that is a benchmark that is useful, but it's often causes problems among people who are benchmarking because it is seductive. As I mentioned in a Twitter thread, it's a sort of a siren song that tries to convince you that that's all you need, when just like the playtesting we were mentioning before and any of these other benchmarks we'll mention later, it is one thing with many weaknesses and also strengths. Like, it's better to know what average damage you're expecting than to not know. But the problem is that average damage can be like hiding a lot of things about like overkill damage that you didn't need, or like the actual chance of hitting being reliable or not.
Yeah, so if you do a huge amount of damage if you hit, but you're very unlikely to hit, then that's very different from if you consistently do a smaller amount of damage.
That's right. The example I gave in my Twitter thread was from a playtester class parody April Fool's idea I had before even working at Roll for Combat. I just am someone who thinks of April Fool's ideas, and so is Steven Glicker. But I had an idea for a playtester class that was just... The idea was it was a class where, like, the story of the class is that the designers didn't know what they were doing and made a terrible class, but that the playtesters, like, fixed the class by playtesting it. And so, but it also is a playtester, so it's very meta. And, like, all of the different subclasses were, like, different kinds of playtesters. So some of them were benchmarkers who were, like, theory crafters who used numbers, and some were playtesters who used playtesting experience. And I put in feats with the trap trait that's usually put on hazards and called them trap feats that were each trap feats for like one of the types of the subclass. And the one for the theory crafting number cruncher benchmarker type, the intelligence as their key ability score, was called Omega Strike. And the way it worked was it is one action, make a strike. If the strike would be a success, a hit or a critical hit, roll 1d100. On a roll of anything but 100, your strike fails completely and has no effect. On a roll of 100, it does 1,000 times the normal amount of damage. Now, this has the expected damage per round that is 10 times higher than a normal strike. However, it is terrible. It is so bad that your character will just be completely unfun for everyone else to play with for the entire campaign. Because even if you actually hit... You'll probably hit a few times.
Yeah, I guess a few times.
And you just instantly kill whatever it is, which is not really very interesting for anyone. And then the rest of the time, you're sitting around doing nothing.
Yes.
Like, that was it. The point was to reveal what single-mindedly looking at one type of metric can do to you. And so that's why that was the trap for the for damage per round. Now, there are other ways to do things, such as you can try to look at the action economy routine and, like, put together certain sets of actions. Think about the fact that your defenses are preventing other people from needing to heal you to keep you up, because if you go down, your actions are going to stop, and therefore your damage per round is going to stop. Think about how much your healing is keeping damage per round up, or how much your buffs are providing in percentage additional damage to all the damage that are dealt by all of your allies.
Based on what numbers they hit on and things like that.
That's right. You could create sophisticated benchmarking that is highly useful. And that's if you're doing numerical benchmarking. Now, there's another way that people think of benchmarking, which is benchmarking based on a sort of paragon or sort of an exemplar, where you look at previous spells or magic items or monsters or whatever you're doing and see how yours compares to that.
I do want to go ahead and raise an easy trap to fall into here, is to say, oh yeah, there's already something that does this, so it's cool for my thing to do that too. Sometimes there are things that have a feature that's like, that class or that spell or whatever, its shining main feature. And so it's going to be great at that, and it's not going to be quite as good at other things. So, like, for example, the fighter's accuracy, right? The fighter's accuracy is the core thing of the fighter. So you're not going to want to say, oh, well, the fighter has fighter accuracy, so I'll give my thing fighter accuracy.
I'll give my barbarian fighter accuracy.
Okay, and then the wizard is this type of proficiency in spells, so I can give this kind of proficiency.
that proficiency spells to the fighter.
Yes, exactly. So you're going to want to take a look at, when you take a look at things, you're not just going to want to take a look at one piece of them, you're going to want to take a look at the whole package of it. Where are its strengths, where are its weaknesses, where does it shine, and where does it need to rely on other team members to keep up.
Also, crucially important.
Mm-hmm.
Crucially important. When new things are getting designed, you could think of it as like there's a little window, and it's like pitching in baseball.
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to pitch right in the middle of the strike zone, and sometimes you'll be more on the edge of the strike zone. Sometimes you'll be out of bounds,
mm-hmm.
and it'll be a ball. And in terms of power level wise, that means that no matter what you do, some of the things that are going to be published are going to be too weak,
mm-hmm.
outside of the strike zone even, or too strong. They just will. Which means that when you're designing something, the last thing you should do is go look
mm-hmm.
for the weakest or strongest thing you can
mm-hmm.
find in some random subsidiary book, even if it's a very prominent subsidiary book,
mm-hmm.
and be like, well, I guess I have to design it to this level now because there's something this weak here, so I have to do it, or there's something this strong here, so I have to do it. Try to go back to
mm-hmm.
the initial incarnation, usually the core rulebook, when you're deciding something.
Yes.
Otherwise, you're going to not just create power creep or possibly power like crunch, but
mm-hmm.
a power spiral.
Yes.
Where you now center the strike zone on this thing that was way over here that was overpowered at the middle of yours. And then you're going to hit over there that's even further and further and further and further.
So let's say that you have you have two classes. You have you have the fighter and you have the turbo fighter. And the turbo fighter came out later than the fighter, and the turbo fighter, and you're looking at the fighter versus the turbo fighter, and you ask yourself the question, when would I choose to play a turbo fighter versus a fighter? And you're like, I would basically always choose to play a turbo fighter instead of a fighter. Then
you could call it the Warblade if you want to use a historical example.
Exactly. Then this turbo fighter, or Warblade if you will, is not something that you really want to be using as a comparator. Whereas if you have something and you sit down and you say, okay, well, here's a few things that I can say. Okay, well, I might choose to play the fighter sometimes or the barbarian sometimes. I might choose to play a few of these different ones at different times. I mean, choose to play these different ones in different circumstances.
I do want to put a caveat in that, which is with the Warblade and fighter. If you truly believe that the core game was unbalanced and
mm-hmm.
that the first class that you were looking at was too weak or too strong, then things change. But I think most people agree that that may not be in everywhere, but overall Pathfinder 2 is relatively balanced, whereas
mm-hmm.
not that many people agreed that, like, 3.x fighters were relatively balanced.
Yeah. So having that sort of comparison, when you look at your thing versus the comparator, if you're like, I would want to play my thing in, these circumstances, but there's also a large set of circumstances where I would want to play this other thing. There are ideas that are better realized under these different ones. It's not just like, oh, this is better in almost all circumstances.
Exactly. So I want to actually circle back from this point
mm-hmm.
to playtesting for a moment. Because guess what is actually the weakness of some of those, like, small grouping playtests that I said were often the best for signal to noise ratio. One of the weaknesses they can have if you're trying to make a popular appeal product, which is actually fine if you're only trying to appeal to a certain audience,
mm-hmm.
is that you can wind up with an echo chamber.
Yes.
And your echo chamber often is involving people who have an agenda to move something, like, down or up in power
mm-hmm.
level, and then they all load it up into your playtest. You're less likely to see that in a very open playtest, although you still
mm-hmm.
might, especially if they're loud and they drive people out.
Yeah.
For example, I've seen playtests before, not for Paizo, but for other
mm-hmm.
things, where just, like, the intent was to move the bar and compare things to the most broken
mm-hmm.
stuff that could ever happen in Pathfinder 1st Edition. And to the point that I saw someone put in, like, an example character that they were comparing to who was, like, nearly the most broken barbarian that could possibly be built
mm-hmm.
in Pathfinder 1st Edition. Superstitious, pouncing beast totem, all of those things that you would have. But they didn't take the barbarian power that like tanks your armor class into
Mhm.
nothing and raises your accuracy even more.
Mhm.
And they were met by all of the playtesters, more or less. Anyone like me who I was watching, I didn't
Mhm.
say anything because I didn't want to be piled up on too.
Mhm.
A whole bunch of people were just like, "You were a troll," to the person who put it that
Mhm.
barbarian. You're trollishly putting an obviously weak example here just to try to make it seem like the playtest stuff is overpowered. Because you didn't pick that one thing, even though you built something that was the cookie cutter with one other option that gave it like 12 more armor class than
Mhm.
the cookie cutter, because the thing that they picked raised their armor class by a lot.
Yeah.
And it was like,
No.
yeah, this is something that can happen in playtests and not just in benchmarking, where you
Yes.
can wind up in big trouble if you take the very highest, most broken thing you can find that it was ever published, and we're like, well, it must be okay because it
So
got
know
published.
your power level, your intended power level when you start. You know,
Yes.
you probably want to shoot for something that's balanced with what already exists. And
But also what
yeah.
already exists in the baseline.
In
Don't
the
look
baseline,
for
yeah.
the strongest, most broken thing you can possibly find. That probably was broken. It's not
Mhm.
your imagination. There's not like, the books are not tablets that came down from a mountain having been passed down by a divine providence in no way that they can be wrong.
Mhm.
If you're like, this can't be right, it seems overpowered, but you know what? The people at Paizo or the third party or wherever it was, they can't be wrong. They're game
Mhm.
designers. No, we can be wrong. We've been wrong.
Yes.
It probably is.
There is no such thing as a perfect book.
It probably is. Like, everything has some stuff that's overpowered and stuff that's underpowered. So then don't use that as an assumption that everything can be at that power level. You're going to throw yourself off.
Mhm.
All right, so that is a good caveat for benchmarking, but it's important to note that I was mostly talking about here, like designing a new feat or designing a new monster.
Yeah.
And what a designer would use when they were checking in something like Freelancer wrote for that. What would you use if you are, because this is one of the hardest things to do, but something that Linda's really good at, and I don't want to put you on the spot too much for this,
yeah,
but
no worries.
what would you use for an adventure, knowing that you don't get to play test it, to try to figure out like how you untangle the structure and all the other things as part of benchmarking rather than play testing?
There's a few different things that I'm going to look at. First of all, I'm going to try to take a look at if this monster is intended to fit into one of the categories that's very different and extreme in some way. So that's going to be your things like incorporeal creatures with really high defenses, creatures that have really low defenses but really high hit points, like oozes. Because if they are that, I want to say, okay, that is part of their intention to be way outside of the normal numbers, and so I'm going to want to look very carefully at what I'm comparing them to, in an even more special way. But generally, I'm going to be wanting to look at two different things. I'm going to want to look at the monster building guidelines from the Game Mastery Guide that talk about what kind of numbers you should be looking at for what level, and see where they fall relative to those. Make sure that they have a well-balanced set of strengths and weaknesses in the same categories. So, you're not going to have a monster that's all strong in defense and all weak in offense, or all strong in offense or all weak in defense. You're going to have ones that may have like more hit points while they have less AC, or, more damage while they have less accuracy and things like that. You want to look at that for sort of the baseline numbers, and then if they have something weird like incorporeal or like ooze or things like that turns things way off, you'll want to really look at other sample monsters that are in that category. You'll probably want to look at other sample monsters that are in that category anyway, especially if you have things like a monster that has an attack that inflicts a condition. Where does that condition start to come online? You're not going to have a monster that's level 1 that's like, aha, I'm going to make you sick in 3.
I will eat your soul.
I will eat your soul. I will do whatever.
I'm level -1. On a successful hit, Fortitude Save, your soul is devoured. It can never be restored.
Yes. You're going to want to look at when those effects come online. You're also going to want to look at whether or not how hard it is to get those effects to stick. Are they something that only sticks if, on a critical success from the monster, a critical failure from their target? How long do they last too? Are they something that's going to last just for a round? Or are they something that's going to last for a fight? Or there's something going to last between multiple fights? A good comparator that I like to look at too is not just other monsters, but also spells that do similar things. If a monster has something that it can just do every round, then, that shouldn't be a thing that a spell of the highest level that monster would do, because that's not something, the monster couldn't cast that spell every round.
That makes sense.
You're also going to want to take a look at things like their action economy, what their typical turn looks like. You know, if a monster has something that it can do, if a monster has something that's one action that they can do over and over again, you know, you don't want them to have something that's so powerful they're just going to want to spam that one action over and over again. You want to look at, and you also don't want them to have a million different things that they can do. You want them to have things that are sort of a few different iconic turns, perhaps, that they can put together based on the situation, so the GM's not having to flip through and look at a bunch of different powers and abilities to make the monster come together. Especially as monsters get into higher levels, you want them to be flexible to deal with common PC strategies. So, you know, once a monster is past the level where you can expect PCs might be able to fly, you're going to want to make sure that monster can fly or has a good ranged attack or other ways to deal with what the PCs are going to be dealing with. Conversely, you don't want to have monsters that have a very versatile toolkit who are going against really low-level creatures. So, like, you know, we were talking about the Manticore before. You're not going to want a creature that's flying super fast and launching things from a long distance against parties that are lower level and may not have the tools to deal with that yet. So I'm going to be looking at spells, definitely. What kind of spells and powers are the PCs going to have access to, and what kind of spells and powers would the monsters have access to? Also, like, if a monster is going to be good at something, really good at something, is that part of the monster's story rather than just like throwing really high numbers at the monster for like, oh, I just want it to be a jack of all trades. It can definitely be tempting, particularly with like final bosses and villains, and you get invested in them. Like, oh yeah, I want them to be really strong, but they've all got to have weaknesses, you know. So like thinking about their saving throws, you know, is it their body that's the strongest? Is it their reflexes? Is it their will? And letting them have weaknesses. And if you feel yourself tempted to say, oh, well, you know, oh, but they should be better, like maybe do you want to make them higher level and balance them out a little differently? We also think about things like the balance of the encounter and the situation, because a creature that's a boss monster, by virtue of being higher level, may have access to more powerful abilities that could be more of a problem for PCs that are lower level than it. Like, you know, if it's got some kind of a paralysis thing, or and it's a solo, or conversely, if you have large numbers of that monster that are all piling on, then something that may not be an issue when you only have one of them could suddenly become an issue. A good example for this is like area attacks. You know, if you have one monster with a big damaging area, you know, that can be nasty, but it's probably going to be okay compared to like, oh yeah, you know, I've decided to put 8 monsters in this combat and they've all got the area. Well, now suddenly your PC, who's really not good at reflex saves, is getting dinged really hard and might go down. Or, you know, if you have a lot of creatures that can inflict a negative condition, you know, and the PCs are suddenly in the aura and 8 auras that cause you to become sickened, but the DC's not that high, but suddenly, guess what? You rolled 8 saves, you're probably going to fail. So thinking about how those effects interact and choosing to design encounters in a way that you're not going to be like, oh my god, you need to deal with, oh my god, like this is different because there's so many of them, or, you know, because this monster is so accurate and so hard to hit. And things like hardness too, those kinds of defenses can get really nasty for boss type monsters, because if they're like, oh, it's way higher level than you and it's got like the top level of hardness that you can have for its level, well, that's going to be a lot for those PCs to chop through. So you want to think about what kind of resources that the characters have in the context of the adventure. One of the adventure design principles that we had, particularly for lower level encounters, is, you know, you bring it back to like first edition, right, where it's like, oh yeah, you know, you can't damage incorporeals without your magic weapon. Well, you better make sure that the PCs have some magic weapons that were conveniently available to them earlier in that adventure, so that you know that they have that kind of resource. Because when you're making published adventures, you know, you're not assuming that the GM is necessarily going to be going in and customizing everything exactly for the group or predicting things. Because when a GM picks up published adventure,
you can use the Jason Bowman method, because Jason loves to put in things that are diabolical, where there is a shadow in the Pathfinder 1 adventure that he wrote for first level characters. And it's in a room that if you had a few minutes to search it, there is a magic weapon in there. But during that time, you're being killed by the shadow. So after if you somehow survive, you're like, oh, now here's a magic weapon, and you feel so bad. It's hilarious.
Mm-hmm.
I played through that, and we were groaning when we found the magic weapon.
And we also get playtest data too from people's reports. I mentioned the hardness because like animated armor is one that we've gotten mentions in like organized play scenarios. People are like, oh, that hardness is really high. So like if you played recent Pathfinder Society scenarios, you may have noticed the frequent appearance of like the animated leather armor, which is like a variant that's a little that has like I think it's got like more hit points and less hardness or whatever. I forget exactly how we shifted that around, but
yeah, I mean, animated metal armor is definitely one where you definitely want to have someone who can do a big hits or hit accurately. But in a Pathfinder Society group, you don't know what the heck is at your table.
Yeah.
And you could have a table that's so unbalanced in who's in it, or that has a lot of low B characters who are not going to be able need a 20 to get the crit that blows off the armor, and they just cannot do anything except for 20.
Society scenarios break one of the guiding principles of the game, which is make everyone the same level. So
it's like make everyone the same level if you can, and if you don't, definitely don't go beyond one level apart. And society scenarios are like, haha, we could be 3 levels apart.
Yeah, so they have to have some other considerations with what they do for that reason.
Society scenarios are sometimes made up of one character who the encounter building guidelines thinks could beat the entire rest of the party combined.
Yes.
And may very well be the guidelines may very well be correct.
But that's necessary.
Yeah.
So we figured.
Like, I think a 4th level character maybe can beat 3 first level characters.
Yeah, I think so too.
It depends on who the 4th level character is and who the first level characters are.
But at any rate, that's just that's some general rambling.
That's encounter building. Now, what about how would you benchmark? So that is sort of somewhat connected to monster building. So it's something I understand from monster building, and that is sort of the more similar side to the benchmarking I was talking about with like feats and spells and monsters. How would you benchmark the rest of the adventure though? Like the parts that are like making progress without combat through like skill checks and possibly subsystems, and like the structure of the adventure, even if it doesn't have numbers in it, just the way it can branch and things like that.
Oh, like adventure pacing?
Adventure sort of pacing and possible branching into different paths of the adventure, and like the DCs of like doing things other than combat.
Okay. Well, I like to use flowcharts and consider making sure that you don't close off any opportunities. The harder it is to make it through any particular solution, the more required it is to have other ways around. So you can totally have something where there's like, oh yeah, the lock to get through this door is super difficult, and not all PCs might be able to. But if you do that, then you're gonna need to make sure there's a back entrance that they can find, or that they can smash down the door, or that they can trick the guards, or any number of combination of alternatives. Generally, though, the preference is to present a lot of different options for how they might approach things. So you might have a situation where there's like a social situation, and you can try to resolve it in different ways, like with the influence subsystem, where there's a lot of different skills, and it's not just the diplomacy. You're going to want to vary things up in terms of the kinds of encounters that you include, so that you have some that are quick and easy, both in the skill perspective, where it's just like, oh yeah, you did a couple of skill checks and you're done. And then some that are more in depth with subsystems and things like that. You're just like, oh yeah, now we're going to do a heist, or we're going to infiltrate, or we're going to do an influence. And the same goes for encounters in combats too. You want to have like some that are low and some that are moderate, and you're going to want to have like a severe boss. But that really also depends on the kind of encounter that you're doing. There's some guidelines in the Game Mastery Guide for different adventure templates, like, oh, this is a horror adventure, this is a mystery adventure, that gives some suggestions for how you might want to break down that distribution of encounter difficulties to give the right sort of feel. Because there's not really a wrong answer on how to do it. You're going to have some groups who want to have an experience that's more skewed toward skill versus combat. Or, they were like, oh yeah, today we want to do a dungeon crawl that's super combat, or today we want to do a high intrigue adventure. It's more about the feel that you want to give in most cases, although there's certainly a sense of fatigue that can creep in if you have a lot of complicated and difficult things in a row. So even if you're doing something that's focused on, lots of social things or lots of combat things, you're still going to want to vary up that difficulty and give periods of rest and recovery. Generally, you're not going to want to string like, oh yeah, you have 5 moderate encounters in a row and you can't rest. Like usually you're going to want to have some kind of rest opportunity between encounters, unless the encounters are relatively easy or the PCs knew what they were getting into, that they were going to be going into a situation where they'd have a string so they can budget their resources accordingly.
That makes sense.
Is that what you were getting at? It was a very broad question.
I mean, I just wanted to hear, because you probably more than anybody else in Pathfinder 2nd Edition have gone into adventures using your benchmarking and knowledge of adventures as opposed to playtesting them all and fix those kind of
Another thing that we have
issues.
is we have guidelines for authors for society scenarios too, of like how many encounters to put in depending on the level. So it might say, oh yeah, for this level you should have like 3 major encounters and 2 minor encounters. And then so we would define like a major encounter as like, a moderate combat or like a longer social scene or things like that. And a minor encounter would be something that would be like 20 minutes or less to resolve. And where you may have some things that go beyond a major encounter, like an extensive subsystem could take multiple of those slots. But just to sort of pace things out, because we do have more strict time limits for those.
That makes sense. So we have a question from chat from Zia La Telesia, who's GMing at the end of the month and wants suggestions on dealing with an overpowered character in combat other than deliberately attacking them. Well, depending on how they're overpowered, sometimes deliberately not attacking them can help too.
Yeah,
but I'm assuming they're overpowered in the terms of just like glass cannon that will kill everything immediately on their turn if they get a turn.
You're probably, are they overpowered in area damage, or are they overpowered in single target damage, or both? Because if they're a character that, for example, can do a lot of damage to one target, then filling the map with a lot more foes so that the other players, they need the other players to contribute to take other things down, can assist. Whereas if they're overpowered in area damage as well, that can get a little trickier.
I'd say ultimately, like, they're just... Many tabletop RPG editions are let you build something that is broken to the point, and they said offense and defense, that they just kind of win compared to the other characters. And if you've got a group and one person is One Punch Man and the other people are just trying to play normal heroes, the way around it is to play a different game, right? Or talk to the person who has One Punch Man and try to get them to dial down, which is going to make them very upset and they're not going to enjoy it. Or try to get them to help the other people be equally overpowered and then make ridiculous, and then spend hours and hours of your own time making the encounters ridiculously hard. But like, I would say that try playing Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And if you already are playing Pathfinder 2nd Edition, I'm surprised that there was someone who's had offense and defense that was that high that they outshowed everyone else by a massive amount, because one of the goals of the system was to prevent that.
Well, I would say that what I was starting to get at there is the idea of making sure that there are ways that other people can contribute. Like, maybe they're overpowered, if they're overpowered in combat, but then they invested everything in combat and they're not as strong in, like, some of the social skills or some of the other systems. Because sometimes subsystems deliberately abstract away from the thing where, I mean, influence was partially intended to make sure that, like, you can't just have a bard who diplomacy hammers and then says, everyone else go sit down, I'm going to do all the talking. So having systems within the game that require everyone to participate to complete, like, you know, you have chases or you have other things where everyone's rolling and they need a number of successes as a group. And sure, you know, maybe that character's overpowered so they're going to critically succeed more, but they can't fully get everything on their own. Or split objectives where you can't be in every place at once. You know, somebody needs to be disarming the trap while somebody's fighting the monster. And that PC can't do everything, so other people need to have ways that they can contribute.
You can try to ameliorate it with that.
This is a TTRPG event, so I'm guessing this is like kind of like a one-session type thing, as opposed to like trying to fix a larger campaign. That's what I'm kind of
worried about, is that it's an event, and you can try to ameliorate it like that. You can. And that's the advice you'll see. It's the best advice you could probably have, but it's not enough because it depends on what the other players want to do. Because maybe they want to fight and they don't want to do an influence encounter, and they want to fight and they want to be useful, but they can't because One Punch Man is gonna one punch.
Yeah. So, and you can't necessarily, for a longer campaign, you can't have every fight be on multiple fronts where there's where there's a battle coming down from the top of the stairs and there's a battle down the hallway, or you have multiple objectives you need to defend at once. And sometimes the splitting the party can make things challenging for if you have a character that's like, yes, I'm going to buff everyone who's close to me. Well, do I buff the overpowered one, or do I heal the overpowered one, or do I take care of the others?
That's right.
But I think definitely if you have a longer term thing, it comes down to a conversation with the players about sort of like the expected power and challenge level and what all of them want. I mean, we've certainly had players in our group in the past who like don't really care that much about their character's combat effectiveness. They care more about how powerful their character is outside of combat. So if they're outshone in combat, then they're just kind of like, yeah, whatever this is.
And then everybody else wanted high power.
But then everybody else wanted high power.
It works. No, it's fine.
Yeah.
But it doesn't work when everybody kind of wants to contribute to combat, but one person is much stronger than the others. It sounds like Zia is not playing PF2, and is building up experience in it. I would say just take the plunge. Get the beginner box, or just try to GM. There's so many more GMing tools in PF2 than there are in many other systems. And there are guardrails, there are ways that make it easier. And that's why people often say, like, it's much easier for a new player to pick up 5e, for example, because you don't have to do much. There's not a lot of customization. You can get a character almost instantly, and it's easy for them to learn. But it's much easier for a GM to learn GMing in PF2. For a variety of reasons. So I'd say give it a shot. Even if you couldn't DM in successfully very much in 5e, PF2 might be much easier. And if you can in 5e, you definitely will be able to in PF2, unless your style kind of really kind of jars with it, because your style is very much like, you improv how the rulings on everything works, and you change what you're gonna do every time, and it's like, oh, this time we're grappling, but I'm gonna use something else than we did last time.
Also, like highlighting the contributions of the players who aren't like necessarily doing as much damage, like when they finish something off, like it becomes a bigger deal than when like the character who's always super overpowered
can help
things.
And that is a great way to help support characters, or when it's not that much of a disparity.
Yeah.
But if it's enough of a disparity, it can wind up seeming sarcastic.
Yeah. No, you can't do it if one person's doing like 2 damage and the other person's doing 200.
It can wind up seeming sarcastic, where it's like, the Balor Lord has come out with 9 Merilith generals and an army of 200 dretches, and One Punch Man is like, and the Lord is dead, the 9 Meriliths are dead, and like 5 dretches
good job, you killed the dretches.
And 5 dretches are left, and then Timmy stabs one of the dretches, and you're like, whoa, Timmy, you defeated one of the dretches.
Yeah, obviously at some point
and One Punch says, what about me? He's like, whatever, One Punch Man. Good job, Timmy.
No, like, obviously not to that extent, but there are cases where, like, when you see those other characters doing something that's legitimately like, hey, you're the one who, it's like, great, that they did great scouting to notice things, or other things like that, or that they came with a really clever idea. Like, make sure to highlight their contributions too, the ones that are about, focusing the contributions that are about, like, tactics or cleverness or other or like, cool ideas or other things that are not just like the high damage numbers or whatever. Or, encourage them to play something where their high defense where like their high stuff can benefit others. Like, if they have a high defense because they're a champion and they're like helping to defend other characters, and it's like, hey, thanks, you helped me out, or like to.
But you're once again assuming a system that's like somewhat balanced, where the person has high defense and therefore they don't have high offense. But unfortunately, Zia has the person with the highest offense is also the person with the highest defense.
We've also had something in our back in our Pathfinder Society First Edition group in Boston, where we had a lot of people who built characters that were pretty strong, but wouldn't bring out the big guns unless they needed to.
You are not worthy of seeing my true power.
So, like, one time we had a GM who's like, we're playing a high-level scenario, and he's worried, like, guys, I don't know if we're going to finish this on time, and we're like, we've got this. And he's like, are you sure? And we're like, yeah.
Yes.
And then like, the wizards started doing, like, Dazing Chain Lightning, or, like, or Dazing Ball Lightning, or whatever, and, everyone
Dazing Chain Lightning is for chumps.
You're right. Dazing Ball Lightning, and, like, everybody else started bringing out their big guns, and we just wiped the floor with everything. So it's like the characters could have done that at any time, but they didn't. So then if the character has a reason why they wouldn't necessarily bring out their full power unless there's a dire circumstance, that could also make it feel less like, this person's always shadowing me.
The problem is that that only works with certain types of characters who
Yes.
are more common in PF1, and it sounds like Zia's 5e character that they're dealing with is not that kind. Ones that have resources, because there is a way to hold back with resourceless characters, but if you do, it winds up seeming so condescending.
Yeah.
Like, there was a person who tried to do it, and I think that it was still maybe somewhat better for their group that they did, as opposed to just killing everything. And the way they did it was they were a sword build martial character with everything into weapon focuses and things with swords in Pathfinder first. But they didn't use their sword, they just punched things. They had nothing for punching. And then if the situation got bad, they would draw their sword. But the thing is, that just feels so condescending if you're the other players and everybody, as opposed to if you have daily resources like a spellcaster and you're like, well, no, we're easily winning,
we're handling this one
I'll
here.
just use my cantrips.
Yeah.
Like, that sort of makes sense. You could play it as the person kind of being paranoid that
it's like,
another...
oh wait, the big boss is going to come out and
even
I
though
won't be ready.
the players know it's a Pathfinder Society scenario and there's only a certain number of encounters, the character doesn't know that there isn't an even bigger boss after what seems to be the big boss.
And then when people are like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? It's like, oh yeah, wait, the wizard's been holding on to resources. It feels more,
It feels more natural to do it that way, and thankfully in PF1, not only most classes had that, but the most powerful classes had that. So therefore it was easier to hold back than it is in, say, 5e if their person was like a warlock paladin.
I'm certainly not saying all of these strategies would work in every circumstance, but they're a grab bag of different strategies that has worked in different these cases over time.
Everything you said is good and will help. It is actually gold advice that will help a large number of different people in campaigns that are having issues with a certain amount of disparity. I do fear that Zia's particular thing that was like a single event tournament play and one person is just drastically stronger than all the others and is better at everything, and it's a combat tournament, so they don't have the other things. It may not work in that instance, but that is the exception that proves the rule that everything that you said is very helpful.
Yeah, I don't... If it's a combat tournament and there's one character that's just more powerful than everyone else at everything and everyone else wants to contribute just as much and it's in a system that doesn't give them a way to do that, then I don't...
You're kind of stuck.
You're kind of stuck.
It sometimes you can get stuck.
I would say the main thing there is to make sure that the player playing the overpowered character isn't exacerbating frustration by like complaining about the weakness of other characters or bragging about their character or engaging in other social behaviors that can warrant frustration.
You can also split the group between the people who are building strong characters and the people who aren't, if you don't want to force one of them to not have fun by forcing them to buff their characters or forcing them to nerf their characters. Although ultimately, if you can't do that because it's an event and you have to allow everybody in.
You can't do that.
So, if all that doesn't work, just know that you're in a very dicey situation that's like a 1 in 1,000 bad situation. It's not your fault. You're not a bad GM because you can't fix it. The system is against you. And everything about that situation is against you. Try to find a system that will not be against you if you can.
Yep.
So that's our answer to the question from chat. I think we've talked about both playtesting and benchmarking.
Yeah.
And so shall we say goodbye to YouTube and then do an outro and figure out our next episode?
Yes, let's.
All right. Bye, YouTube. See YouTube next time.
Bye.